Vampire Lake is a 2024 low-budget vampire movie, if you couldn't guess by the title. So this is a film that I suspect is a kind of family-made production. A lot of the people involved in it seem to have the same surname, so I'm presuming this is kind of like a, you know, family-run, sort of small independent film company or something. Who employ friends and family into making films. Now the story of this one focuses on a woman who's staying in this kind of cabin in the woods, and she has a kind of beer drinking, gun wielding, kind of loud friend stay with her, as well as her two teenage nieces. So there's 4 of them in total. Now one of these nieces is obsessed with vampires, and she believes that there is this legend that a vampire can be summoned at this lake, which is about 5 miles away from this cabin. And you can summon a vampire and ask something of it, for example. And she actually wants to turn into a vampire. Now everyone kind of just sort of poo-poos it as kind of Twilight fangirl fiction, but she goes off to this lake to summon the vampire, and he is indeed real. And she gives him an amulet that allows him to walk about in daylight in exchange for turning her into a vampire. And he promises to do it once he retrieves a certain book. But things don't go according to plan when, of course, the vampire starts acting like a vampire and killing people. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's talk about it. Now, again, this is a very, very low budget movie. So if you like mainstream films, this probably isn't going to be the one for you. But what can we say that works? Now, I mentioned that this seems to be a movie which is made by friends and family. And that might sound like a negative, and sometimes it can be. But here's where I think it becomes a positive in this particular instance. Is that I actually think the characters come across pretty well in regards to their chemistry. Like these two like adult females who are kind of friends, their kind of banter, and the actual this kind of friend that's visiting, who's this kind of like very loud woman. She's actually quite funny, I've got to say, and she's always kind of trying to prank her friend and these 2 nieces who she sort of like, you know, somewhat takes the sort of the piss off a little bit, and it's quite a fun character. But even the rest of them, and maybe let's say the actual friend who's probably the least developed, but the 2 kind of nieces as well, they have this one's kind of like a quiet girl and the other one's, you know, into this kind of like goth kind of thing. I kind of quite like their all chemistry, and it's clear obviously that these people have kind of known each other off screen. But it does translate to quite good chemistry on screen, and the kind of the dialogue, it's actually reasonable in the fact that you kind of believe them in this role, because they do seem to get on quite naturally, and the dialogue is, you know, it's not too bad actually, I have to say, and it's delivered. I mean, they're not brilliant acting necessarily, but I've got to say, I believe them in their roles, and some of the kind of like the dialogue sequences, I'm not sure if it was kind of improvised or if it was actually kind of more scripted, but it did seem quite sort of reasonably natural and believable kind of banter between these kind of people. So that I kind of quite liked. Now, I also kind of quite like that when this kind of other girl goes off to try and find this vampire, you know, it's a kind of reflection of like a fad. Like she's all like caught up in the hype of vampires for whatever reason, but she hasn't really thought about the actuality of her actions. So she's kind of wrapped up in the romanticism of the idea of being a vampire without thinking about the reality of what it actually means, and it actually would mean killing people and stuff. And it kind of goes to that kind of surface level sort of idea that sometimes people have about certain things. I mean, not just vampires, but anything, without the reality of the situation. It's not always as rosy as it kind of might seem, and I think that's probably a fair reflection of this girl. She's just like a vampire fangirl caught up in the fiction, but obviously she hasn't thought about what she's actually asked. So that I kind of quite liked. The vampire himself is a little bit of a smart-ass. Kind of quite like that. And then we have this other kind of element where there's this kind of random hitchhiker that kind of just turns up, and you know, is he a threat, or is he, you know, is he kind of like has no malevolent intent? You know, he's a bit of a wild card. So there's some reasonable sort of little elements here that I think make it for a little bit more of an engaging watch than perhaps you might think. I also have to say I quite like how this movie ended, because it's a very lightweight film overall, and I have to say I kind of wasn't expecting it to quite end like it did. I won't say why, because I don't want to give the game away, but I thought, you know what, I wasn't kind of expecting that ending. Fair enough, fair play. But let's talk about the negatives. Let's talk about what does not work in this movie. Now, it is low budget film. There's really very little extra in this movie in regards to VFX, panache, visual style, set pieces, gore, practical makeup. Our vampire is a dude who is wearing some fangs, and that's about it. You know, he's got like a vintage sort of style coat, but that's basically all you're going to get. The vampire attacks when we see them are relatively bloodless, and not a lot of even in regards to kind of like fake blood and things like this. So it's a very, very lightweight horror. The other thing is as well is the plot. I mean, you could write the script on the back of a postage stamp. There's really not a lot of actual plot here. This is a film where it could have been a short, I think. And even then, there's not really like a big twist exactly. It's just kind of like, okay, the actual story could have been in a 15-minute short film, I would have said. You know, the vampire fangirl, and that's the kind of the plot really. But there's not much else to it, and that's kind of it. Also, the mythology of the vampire, I don't know if I was quite on board with in regards to how the movie kind of sets it up, because, you know, it's said that this vampire can be summoned, and this girl does summon him, but then we see like on her way there, before she summons him, we see like there's evidence of skeletons and bodies of victims who have been there before. So does that mean this vampire is around and she's just summoning to that point, or is he not there? It doesn't really kind of expand. It seems to be a little vague on the actual sort of mythology here. So she said she's going to summon him, but he already appears to have been there because there's evidence of other victims and things. So, you know, there's that. And she's summoning him in the broad daylight. Now, she gives him an amulet so he can kind of move around in the daylight, but it's already daylight, and so how has he got there and things like this. So it's kind of like, nah, it doesn't really seem to sort of have been particularly well thought out. They do try to play with a little bit of, you know, pop culture vampire lore, and think, well, that doesn't work because that's what we've seen in the movie, so we'll try it, and oh, it doesn't work because that was fiction, this is the reality. But like I said, I think it ends up tripping over the law that it set itself as well, because the sunlight does affect him, but this guy's hanging out in the sunlight, or he's standing behind a tree, but how did he get to the tree, if you know what I mean? And if he just come out of nowhere, how come there's a bunch of victims already lying around? So there's like, I don't know, it hasn't, even though the story's so slight, it still doesn't seem to be massively thought out. This hitchhiker stranger character, is like really amounts to nothing. It's like that could have been an interesting element that could have put a wrinkle in the story, like a wild card, but it doesn't really amount to anything. And you know, even though I kind of quite like the interplay and the banter between these characters, I'm not going to say the acting is like fantastic or anything, because it's obviously, like I said, relatively sort of an amateur production, and the real lack of kind of, like I say, VFX and ambience. There's no real sort of like attempt here to have this kind of this vampire seem scary or anything or threatening. He's just like some guy, you know, and you know, maybe that's the direction they wanted to go. But I suspect that I actually kind of enjoyed this more than a lot, because I still kind of quite like the kind of the dialogue and the sort of the relationship between these kind of characters. And I, as I say, I actually think it ended on a reasonable note. But I'm quite forgiving of B movies, and I think, you know, when you look at the Cold Light Day, the kind of the low tech production here, I think might not interest people, and the very sparse sort of plot, I think also. It's not really going to be a must-see for vampire fans, but I didn't mind it, I have to say. I'll give it a 4 out of 10. I still didn't mind the characters, so yeah, it's a 4 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.